So I'm Nii Ayikwei Parkes, and I'm a writer, editor, dreamer.
Did you get into writing?
Well, writing is something I think I've sort of always done, but I've done consciously since I was about 10, when I saved some work that I'd written because my father read it and thought it was good, and so I started saving things. And I then went on to be a scientist, and at some point during my career decided that I wanted to try being a writer because I owed no money and I could take risks. And so I did. And I then moved to England, did a couple of readings, tried to get some things moving. I got an agent, etc. And then found out that one of the ways, or the more viable ways of making money as a writer, was to perform regularly. And so I started performing. It took a while before I got my first paid gig, which was £15 down in Brixton. And then after that I kept going. I kept a little spreadsheet to see how much I was making from writing, and I was doing the odd job here and there. And then when I felt I was making enough to live just above the poverty line, I kind of then did mainly performance and writing, selling short stories or poems to magazines. That's how I got into it.
Do you remember the first poem that you wrote that made you think, hey, I've got something here?
No. I remember the first poem that I typed on my father's typewriter, the little clangy thing, was something to do with courage. It was one of these conceptual things, and I think I must have been about 13, and just thinking about the concept of courage and what courage really was, and it was some rhyming thing, because I was into rhyme. I know there was despair in there, and unfair. Despair rhymed with unfair, but I can't remember the rest of the poem. But the conclusion of it was that courage is something that's inside you, and only you can decide if an act is courageous or not somebody outside of you. So I was, I guess, maybe a little self-obsessed, but it was one of my first poems.
So when you moved to the UK, and you set about trying to perform more regularly, how did you go about that?
Well, there's a place called the Poetry Cafe, fantastic place, and they have a Tuesday night open mic which is called Poetry Unplugged. It's been going for as long as I can remember. And so what I initially did was I would write poems and I'd go there and I'd read them. And what tends to happen is if your poem rises above the muck or is creamy enough to rise to the top, then sometimes people in the audience would be people who run gigs, and so they'd come up to you and say, would you come and do my gig? And so I got my first couple of gigs that way. The first paid gig was actually from something I went to. I went to a music/poetry showcase called Kindred Spirit, and I really enjoyed it. And so I went up to the host afterwards and I said, I write poetry, would you consider booking me? And Michelle Escoffrey, who was running it with her sisters, said to me, okay, read a poem to me now. And I did, and she liked it and she booked me. And that was my first paid gig. And then after that, once you've been paid once, you can kind of bluff, because you say, well, I usually get paid, and then people kind of tend to try to honor that, whether it's just a little bit of money or it's just your expenses. I remember there was an event called Farrago, and the host generally used to give gifts of some sort when people did things, because if you did a slam, you got a kind of gift or something like that. And then if you did well, then he'd book you, and then if you came back, if you asked, you would get paid. I don't think you get paid if you don't ask, and I was one of those who asked. and so I got paid for that too. So one of the earliest things I learned was, you have to ask sometimes in order to get the kind of appreciation or remuneration or whatever it is that you can get from writing. Sometimes you have to ask. You just have to go up to someone and ask if something can be done, and sometimes it will happen and sometimes it won't happen. So if there's anything I'd say to somebody starting out, is just ask.